Organization meeting, there seemed to have been some confusion concerning our hiring policy and some consternation about it afterwards. And since that happened, I sat down with particularly Dr. Lucy and I and our administrative staff and looked at what could be some possibilities to cause this confusion. And one of the initial areas of confusion was there seemed to be concern about the nepotism. And was there an anti-nepotism policy involved in one, not in the other, and so on. What I can tell you is both policies are the same. The anti-nepotism component was section 1111 from the school code. It's word for word from the school code. So there was no difference. It's mandated, and it was the same in both policies. I did state, some member of the media, I don't remember who it was, that when they asked that since I've been superintendent, we have had hirings under both policies, the old and the new. In my opinion, we had competent and excellent candidates hired under both. Looking at it a little more closely, to prevent some confusion in the future, I think we need to look at taking away as much subjectivity from the policy as possible and adding as much objectivity. To give you an example, where you can look at subjectivity and objectivity. The Praxis scores, which are scores that students must take as they come out of college in their particular area. It's objective in as much as if you are a math student or you're an elementary education student, your Praxis score is your score. However, we also have people who may apply for jobs who may have applied and may not have taken the Praxis. So there could be a little area of confusion there. We look at college transcripts. While it appears to be totally objective, one of the things you need to do is look at the criteria upon which each college or university is judging their students and how that fits with what Pittston area wants to do in hiring their teachers. You could have some that have a stronger background in a certain area and a weaker background in another. And the only way you could really become totally objective on that is to know what each college and university has stressed. There are other aspects of the policy that could be construed, such as poise and the amount of confidence shown by a candidate that would be subjective by the interviewers. And there's always going to be some level of objectivity. But what I'm going to ask to do, I'm going to ask the board tonight, if I can empower our administrative staff, particularly Dr. Lucy and Dr. Dunham, to begin research on hiring policies, not only throughout the state, through the area, what they feel would, in their opinion, would be recommendations on positives and negatives from both policies that we've currently used over the last few years, and from any new policies they may feel would be strong. I would ask them to bring it back to me. I will then in turn turn it over to the board. The board can look it over and decide if they want, what they want to do with it, if indeed they want to do anything. So what I'm asking if you can do that to me.
Mr. Cosgrove, additionally to your presentation, there was, under the point system, wasn't there 20 points given to a candidate who lived in the district, which made it very unfair for anyone outside the district to even make it to the top 3 or 5 in the hiring process?
It does make it difficult, Mr. Shannon, for someone to overcome that. I'll give you an example of, I had personal knowledge of someone applying in the Scranton district, and had they been a resident in Scranton, they would have jumped 50 places as opposed to not being a Scranton resident. So, I don't...
Actually, if I could speak to that for a minute too. We hired 2 individuals under what's called the new hiring policy. And it was a recommendation, actually, of Mr. Haas, our high school principal, that we take a look at that criteria of the points for a Pittston area resident. And Dr. Donovan had taken, maybe along with Mr. Haas and others, had taken some of those criteria, and we were, in fact, tweaking that. I had written some of the pieces where we were going to add in 2 forms of proof of residency, We were going to look at reducing the amount of points that we would be given for residency. There were going to be some additional rubric added in for the classroom, as part of the classroom presentation. And that's actually where we stood in November, that I had recommended to the board that we all take a look at this. And at the December meeting, talk about whether we were going to adopt the new policy with the revisions that were talked about following the 2 hires that we did have. So that was one of the things, Mr. Chairman, that we did talk about, was reducing the number of points for a resident. Because it was told to us that there were a couple candidates that did move up on the list simply because they were a resident, and the administration, or those that participated, felt that it was maybe a little bit too much, and I agree with you.
But I'm confused, because this was not aired to the public as a new hiring policy. This was aired to the public as an anti-nepotism policy. If I understand correctly, let me finish. If I understand correctly, there's anti-nepotism in both policies. And I think what Mr. Cosgrove was recommending is that we research this, and I think it's, he's looking for us as a board to strengthen this policy. So I think what we need to do as a board, rather than air this out with the media, to come together and strengthen the policy. I think that was the basis of it. So that everyone, so that the public understands here, Mr. Linsky, that the intent is to hire the best possible candidate, and that we have no intent not to, initially the law said it's against the law to enact, to hire someone within the district. And quite honestly, I think we're discriminating against people who are giving them 20 points if they live in the district. I've talked to several candidates outside the district who never had the opportunity to make it to the top 3 or the top 5.
And you're right, the anti-nepotism clause that was in both policies is exactly the same. And I think it was the press that turned the professional hiring policy into an anti-nepotism policy. It was no one from this board that ever really said it was an anti-nepotism policy. We have been, and we do have a draft anti-nepotism policy that hasn't been brought before the board yet, that some of the board members have been working on. But no, this was a professional hiring policy. Even if you take a look at the old policy, which I read again today, many of the things that the new policy did were simply put into play things that we were supposed to have right along, which we didn't. It says that for example, such approval shall normally be given to those candidates for employment chosen by the board from a group selected by the superintendent. That's in the old policy. We weren't really following that. It talks about the superintendent shall develop procedures for the recruitment, screening, and recommendation of candidates for employment in accordance with the following guidelines. It talks about after the initial screening, first round interviews will be conducted by a team of administrators and department chairpersons where appropriate. Board members may be observers of the interviews during the first round, and semifinalists will then be presented to the board. We weren't really following this. The new policy really spelled out how to do it. That's really what it was. When the new policy was written, it was simply taking the old policy and adding to it and deleting from it. So it really was a building block from the old policy.
Well, I agree with Mr. Cosgrove that we should research and strengthen the policy. Quite honestly, this appears to be a perversion. The major issue facing this district, there are no jobs. I mean, hiring is not a major issue. If there are jobs, we're going to do it the right way. Major issue facing this district is purely financial. So let's not take our eye off the ball and make sure the public understands that.
Yeah, in close to a year, we hired 2 individuals under this policy, and the new policy said that the top 3 candidates were to be taken before the board based on the selection criteria, both objective and subjective, and then from those top 3, the person hired would be chosen, and that's what was done. Some people were quoted in the paper as saying the policy didn't work. It did work. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. Top 3 came before the board, 1 was chosen. Which happened both times.
All right, and
you just heard from the superintendent who told you it didn't work.
Yeah, I think what we have here, we have the old policy replaced at the last board meeting. I think Mr. Cosgrove is absolutely correct in taking an opportunity to speak with Dr. Lucy about strengthening our policy, which was last revised in 1996, but put back into effect at the last board meeting. And I think that's a good place for us to be.
I actually have a comment on it too, Mr. Cosgrove, you had, when you went over that it really didn't address nepotism, we've had both the same thing. I think it kind of did touch on it in a little sense.
No, it does, both policies did address it.
But I do think the one we got rid of at our reorganization meeting, I do think at least slightly addressed it, in that if there was a member of this board that wanted to get a member of his family a teaching position, they would have to make the top 3 on their own merits. In other words, if they didn't make the top 3,
I believe and I'm going to ask, maybe make sure.
If I may,
but they're identical, it's from state law.
Just to answer your question, Richard, the anti-nepotism provisions of the original policy and the new policy were exactly the same.
I understand
They
that.
remained unchanged by the enactment of the new policy. When the board repealed the new policy at the last meeting, the anti-nepotism provisions remained unaffected by that repeal because of 2 reasons. First, the legislature in the Pennsylvania School Code provides for an anti-nepotism provision as it relates to teachers. Secondly, this district years ago enacted its own anti-nepotism provision as it relates to all employees. And the hiring policy that replaced the old policy, if you will, kept intact the same anti-nepotism provisions as they relate to the school code and as they relate to the existing policy. And I think that was the confusion, not only with the public but also with the media, that the hiring policy itself did nothing to the anti-nepotism law and policy of this district. And I think that was the confusion.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that that policy prevented a family member from getting a teaching job in this district if they weren't in the top 3. The old policy opens the door for number 12 to walk in the door and get the job.
No, the old policy certainly made recommendation from the superintendent for
There
those
were,
qualified.
in the old policy, there were recommendations from the administration, and I know myself, I would not have recommended number 12 on the list to be hired as the
The old policy would not allow the board to circumvent the anti-nepotism law under the school code or the policy under the district regulations.
I understand that, but I also understand that in the last 4 meetings we've had a group of parents come in questioning one of our teachers, why is this happening? And I think the hiring policy that we repelled went a long way in making sure that didn't happen. And maybe I could agree with you guys. I do think we probably do need to really look at a very strong anti-nepotism policy.
Our anti-nepotism policy really doesn't say anything. I know what the state law is, but our provision in here says no teacher shall be employed who is related to any member of the board as defined in statute, unless such teacher receives the affirmative vote of the majority of all members of the board other than the member related to the applicant. There's really no...
Well, the statute
That's
here.
the Pennsylvania legislature enacted that.
Section 10, it's right here. You want to-
But the Pennsylvania legislature enacted the proscription against employing relatives of school directors. And this board, through both policies, kept intact that provision. And there, in addition to that, the district, years ago, went further than the school code provision in further defining relatives and so on. And that policy remains intact today and was unaffected by the action taken by this board at the reorganization meeting when it repealed the new hiring policy. And I'm referring to them as just to differentiate.
All right, very good.
Our anti-nepotism policy, they all end with the statement, unless they are the most qualified. So it kind of, takes any teeth out of the
Well, but that's the legislature does that as well. It's not just the district.
But
The Pennsylvania legislature does that.
But we as a district can do more if we choose.
I presume that you can. There's no prescription against you doing more. There's no prohibition against that. If you wanted to, you certainly could. But the
Pennsylvania legislature has enacted this law in 1949, and it was amended only one time, and that was in 1955. And this has remained the law of the land in Pennsylvania as it relates to the hiring of relatives of school directors. The Pennsylvania legislature has set down rules and regulations regarding it. This district has always abided by it, and in fact enacted a policy further defining who a relative may be. And it goes beyond what the legislature had defined as a relative.
Mr. Gruszkowski has a very good point. I have seen in my 6 years on the board, hires that may not have happened had we had the top 3 criteria in place.
The last thing I would say on the whole issue of media, I told some member of the media that I think it's, no matter what policy we have, it's a hiring policy, it's incumbent upon the administration to recommend nothing but strong candidates to the board. And we take that, from myself on down, I know our administrative staff takes that very seriously. When we do make a recommendation, they will be strong, or we won't recommend.
So your request is to then take
All right,
our policy,
you want to get moving
the
along
old
here a little bit, I
policy,
think.
make some, other,
Bob, I don't
look
want
at
to
some
gather
other
here.
policies,
You want to
and then come up with a recommendation.
Correct.
That's okay.
Screen, I just think it should be pointed out that the old policy, the former policy that we reverted to, survived 14 years. It survived through an FBI federal corruption probe that yielded no charges of wrongdoings, and it also hired many of the fine teachers that have increased our PSSAs and made it such a high score.
Good point, Dr.
It's something that should be noted.
Yeah, and on that note, I just wanted to say one thing, being a new board member and being painted with that brush that was in the papers and on the news, that's what we should focus on with these educators and the PSSA scores that be #1 in Luzerne County and our students. That's what we need to focus on. I agree with nepotism and want everything to be on the up and up and legal and hire the best teachers for our kids, but that's why we're here. So we should focus really more on helping our principals and our superintendents and our educators to provide better education for our kids, so we can end it there.
I agree. That's exactly why the hiring policy was adopted.
All right, Albert,
I think I'll make a motion in the regular meeting
Can I just add one
to
quick
adopt this, the one we repelled, and I think you're in agreement that we do want to get the best, most
If I can just add one quick thing. When we went through this hiring policy and we started it, I attended every interview. I attended the daytime interviews, the evening. I did not miss an interview. We found as we went through the process, it needed to be tweaked. Because some things were working very well, some things were not. One of the things Dr. Donovan did was set up a Rubik's scoring, which was much better than what we had looked at. So that's what we were in the process of doing, was actually doing the tweaking with the things that we found that weren't working, like the 20 points and other things. So I just think that the two policies together, we put together and make a really good policy.
I think our superintendent, starting with our current policy in place, is going to do that and get back suggestions to us regarding how we can strengthen that. I think that's excellent. Thank you. Thank everybody for their input.
Just one more comment.
Albert.
Mr. Cosgrove, look at the revised policy that we had the input from Dr. Donovan and the other administrators.
Well, we absolutely will.
It was not the one that was in effect, it was the one that we were working on.
Actually, I'm going to ask, especially Dr. Donovan and Dr. Lucy, to start the initial process and look at all the policies.
You're up, Albert.
In the public eye that it was a nepotism policy. It never was meant to be that. It was a hiring policy that was put in effect. The hiring policy was put in effect for one reason, because when we had our dark days, when George first became our superintendent, we sat down in the auditorium and basically we said that we had to be transparent. That we had to go through and make sure that people saw what we were doing in our hirings, in every motion, in our purchases, anything that this board would do. So therefore, we put this, we started working on this policy. 1 week after you gentlemen voted to repeal that policy that was put in effect, Wilkes-Barre area came out in the newspaper and said that they're going to initiate a hiring policy.
Right, and I think it's important to point out we never had one before last week. Correct?
Let me finish and then I'll give you any time. But No, I'm not out here to crucify anybody. I just want to bring this up. This policy was put in effect because we wanted to be transparent. You know, we had one board member, Mr. Latona, stated that basically the hiring policy worked, it went through FBI scrutiny and everything else. Well, no, it didn't. Because we had one board member who was grabbed by the FBI that hired 6 family members under the old policy. So it didn't meet scrutiny.
Why, I don't
He wasn't charged.
why he was
That wasn't the charge.
grabbed by the.
No, that wasn't the charge, and the reason there was no charge is because nepotism isn't a felony.
That's not exactly true.
Nepotism charged with it. But, you know,
But there's only one individual that I know in the past year since this was in effect whose family member was hired. But
no,
there's only
it's-
one in the past since January.
Since January, fine, but before that, why the other hiring policy was first put into effect, why it was being contemplated before it put in effect, why it was written, was because we saw that there was a need because, again, one family member, and the members of the media that were here clearly documented how many family members he
I
hired.
think your perception is fine, but your perception on why that was redone may be different than other people's perspective, and you bringing that
Well,
before
that's
us
one
is
of the
very
reasons.
fair.
Other people had other
But it
reasons.
certainly wasn't mine, and I don't believe it was, I don't believe it was a few members of the board at that time. I can only speak for myself. I think the policy that we had before that one was an excellent one. I think with Mr. Cosgrove at the helm and following that policy, I think the best person will be hired, and I don't have any question that any change in that policy made any difference whatsoever.
It just makes it so much easier when you had a policy, when you have the top 3 candidates. And even if politics plays its role, once those top 3 are picked, you're still getting one of the
And again,
top
I
3.
have to
It doesn't
disagree with
be
you.
the highest.
I really believe that
But
we
again,
always
Wilkes-Barre
had top
area,
candidates.
Wilkes-Barre area, in the article that was in last week's Times Leader, basically stated that because 2 of their board members also suffered a little bit of fate at the hands of the FBI, basically what they did, they want to institute this policy to make sure it clears up, because their policy now is basically any director can go in there and say, okay, I want this person, go to the next director, I want this person, go to the next director, I want this person, and that policy would eliminate this.
Terry,
You know,
Well, that's their policy.
First
That
of
certainly
all,
wasn't ours.
I think what came out of this meeting was the fact that we want to strengthen this. We want to strengthen the policy. If your question is, why did it come up at the first board meeting? You shouldn't have came up at that meeting.
Absolutely.
Okay, but that's not the case. The whole idea is to strengthen this policy, because any hiring policy, whether it's a public policy or private enterprise, is work in progress. There is no silver bullet on hiring policy. And I think you heard Mr. Cosgrove say that he's going back to the administration. He himself feels that the new policy, and let's not get political about this. He himself feels that the new policy had some flaws in it. The old policy had some flaws in it. Okay, let's put it on the table. Let's look at it. The whole intent of what we're saying here is this policy is going to be strengthened. Let's not measure one against the other.
I understand that, Mr. Chairman, but
That-
within 15 minutes of putting your hand in the air
Okay.
and swearing, to put politics in front of the public, best interest, in hirings, I just don't think it was right. That's all I have to say. Thanks, gentlemen.
Quote unquote, was someone played. I had a teacher, I'm not going to say any names, I don't want to step on any toes, I don't want to get anyone in trouble. She came to school and she laid down behind her desk for a day and she slept because whatever occurred the night before or whatever she was going through, but a teacher of our children in school, me being one of them, slept behind her desk. And I have to think that if it were a top 3-tier policy where the top 3 candidates were the only ones being scrutinized to be hired, that someone that would sleep behind their desk would not be hired for this scenario. That's all I have to
Ben.
say.
Very good.
Ben, one question. Did you get an opportunity to read the 2 policies?
I did not, but I'm just from my own, what I could gather from seeing everything that's happening, I could gather that had a policy been in place where only the 3 candidates that scored the highest on everything that was possible would not be hired if she was going to come to school.
Ben, do you think that any top 3 candidate anywhere at some time in the future, because we don't have a crystal ball, may be sick or may develop an issue that needs to be dealt with?
However, is it not,
I don't have a crystal ball.
Is it not a policy of the school for every teacher to be able to take a sick day when they feel ill and stay home and not to come to school when they're supposed to be teaching a child and sleep behind their desk?
And do you ever come to school and get sick, then have to be picked up?
I did. However, she came in, I had her for first period, and she came in right from the morning. I remember it. She came in, she put her bags down, she went to the teacher next door and said, I can't do this, I need you to watch my class, opened the partition and slept behind her desk. I just wanted to make a point that had there been a hiring policy with a three-tier top 3 candidate, I don't think that would have happened. That's the point I wanted to make.
Okay, thanks.
Policies? Have you?
Absolutely.
And why did you vote for the new policy over the old policy last January?
There were
Has it
several
passed
issues.
9-0, so what was the reason?
There were several issues. I'll state it very quickly. I don't want to hold everybody up. Basically, we were all very positive and excited when the new policy went into effect. We passed it 9-0. Wonderful. It looked good on paper. It worked on paper. Mr. Lampman, in practice, it didn't work. There were several issues that we felt didn't address correctly what we value to be good educators in our district. There are some intangibles that come out in several interviews. For example, there are several intangibles that may come out in a recommendation letter from a teacher who was the mentor teacher for the teacher applying for the position during her student teaching. I, being in education for 20 years, value those letters greatly. Some other members on the board may not. I value those extremely well, and I take those into consideration. Now, when an individual teacher goes for an interview and stands in front of a board and is asked to display or represent a lesson, okay, 20, 25 minutes, is every board member in that room aware of what differentiated learning is? Or what teaching to special needs, let me finish, what's teaching to a special needs person is? Would the individual board member be as familiar with looking at and really honestly judging whether or not that teacher is doing that properly? Those are some of the things, and then we get into the praxis scores. Praxis scores depend on the pool of individuals taking it at the time. School scores, grades, a 3.8 at one institution, not the same as a 3.8 in another institution. To mention nothing of the 20 points there. And I just pointed out a few, but Mr. Lampman, there's a sincere question about the hiring policy that was passed in January. This board, after being pretty much elected after the primary, had several months to look over many policies.
What are the policies that they looked over?
You're asking specifically about this one. They're talking about the hiring policy now. Had an excellent opportunity to discuss and review. And I think every member here was very, very comfortable voting on that. So having said that, now we're starting, Mr. Cosgrove going back to the administration, and we're going to look at a way to make it better.
Well, that's great.
Thank you very much, and I think you've done an excellent job.
I think by, again, bringing up, it was brought up, what, the first or second motion of last week's meeting, and the way it was perceived by the public.
I believe it was...
whatever. The way it was perceived by the public was very political, the way it was brought up, because Mr. Kelly, Mr. Donahue, Mr. Chandra has never attended an interview on the school board. Correct.
In the capacity of a school board member, that is correct.
Correct. They have never attended. So how would they know so quickly why it wasn't working? And why were the excuses given in the paper not like this? I appreciate what you're trying to do now, but I think it's damage control. And what I'm telling you is, you weren't hired, or you weren't elected to be on a majority. You weren't elected to be on a minority. You were elected to represent the taxpayers. So you have shunned Mr. Linsky 2 meetings in a row now, and you showed very little respect to the man. And he's an elected official just like you are.
That's correct.
So I think you're doing a lot of damage control, and what I'm gonna tell you, what I would like to see this board do now is put a hiring freeze in place right now until a new policy is made or voted on by every member of this board.
I think
I don't wanna see it
you saw
three, four,
you saw
five.
Mr. Malone's presentation. I think
Well,
we're going to need to
you
discuss
have to
anything
get a
coming up.
committee, and a hiring committee, and get people from the public
We have a
involved.
committee as a whole, and each member
Because
of this
what,
board will be
you know,
involved.
you
in the
cannot
process.
sit there, Tony, and tell me that the old policy worked. I've come
Certainly
to
can. You
meetings
looked at the PSSA
for
stuff.
11 years, and I've seen people getting jobs that, like that young man said before, is the truth. And I know you're going against some issues now in the school with some teachers that are just doing that. We saw friends, we saw relatives, and we can't have that. We got to make sure that the best person possible gets the job. And by you spinning it, saying, well, okay, now we're going to do that, that's fine. But I want you to represent me, and I want you to represent the taxpayers and the students to make sure you get the best pick. Don't come back secondhand and say, okay, now here's what we're going to do. Because it's political, and it looks political. So what I want you to see you do is work on that ASAP, give the taxpayers a deadline, say March 1st. You're going to have a new policy in place, or voted on, and move on from there. Then do your hiring. And if I see a hiring from now till that's in place, I will call it a political hire. So that's what I'm asking the board to do. Work hard. You want to get a committee, you want to get people from the public, that's fine. Do it. But let's resolve this once and for all.
Thank you for your
Okay?
response.
Thank you.
And in that vein, we need not only a professional hiring policy, we need a hiring policy which we've been talking about for quite some time for all positions, whether it be a secretary, a maintenance man, whatever.
Joe Lakuta, Piston Township. I agree with Bob that just spoke. Also, I didn't understand because you cut out Mr. Linsky. Are we saying that Mr. Saporito isn't qualified, that we need more lawyers? I think he more than qualified.
To make a motion that this board puts a new hiring policy in place no later than March 1st, 2012, that will lead to greater transparency of our hiring process.
Well, the implication is that the policy that we currently have is not transparent enough.
Well, I think everybody agrees there's problems with, everybody has issues with both policies.
Let me ask you, can we have, as we directed Mr. Cosgrove, discuss the policy and some changes he would like to look at? And at next month's board meeting, we entertain that motion where we put a deadline on when we would expect those to be in place?
I think we need to put a deadline in. I don't really want to see this go away. I really want to see it addressed, get adopted, and I don't want to see issues happen like the one.
I think we're not really asking the administration how they feel about that kind of a timeline. I don't object to your reason for doing so. I think it's a very fair one, but I don't want to overburden the administration.
We'll certainly work with these timelines and we'll do the best of our ability to make sure we get it done.
I'll second that motion.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Could you read the motion again? Could you state it again?
You know what I didn't write it down.
Go ahead.
Yeah, basically what it is we'd like to have a hiring policy in place that addresses, I guess that's, only give me a minute, I'll write something down. I didn't write it down.
Mitch, can we even put tentative in there, just in case there's, maybe some issues that we need to discuss?
Yes, but I mean, there's a lot of people here from the public, so I think
I think we discussed this already pretty much, so that the administration is going to look at the policy that we do have in place currently.
then how about we just make, how about the motion just states that we adopt?
Like myself.
Yeah, we will adopt the
They
new hiring
may come
policy
back with a
March
deadline
1st,
and they may state
2012.
that they're happy with current policy.
Yeah, I got a better one.
You see where I'm going, and under which case we would be kind of strong-held by the motion.
If you heard what you were saying, have you read the old policy? The
Absolutely.
old policy says basically what the new policy says. The only thing the new policy did was put specific criteria in place. The old policy says that the superintendent is supposed to put those criteria in place. The old policy and the new policy both say that there's supposed to be a classroom presentation. They're both in there. It's just we were not following. We were not doing any classroom presentations. We had a rubric prepared by our principal in charge of curriculum, and she explained to us, here's the things that you look for when the teacher is doing their presentation. We were well prepared in those interviews.
And now I'm going to ask you to listen to yourself. You just made mention that a rubric for a hiring policy was created by our director of curriculum. And I think that our director of curriculum, obviously what we're doing in our PSSA scores is to be commended for the hard work she does in curriculum. I would rather not see our director of curriculum involved in a hiring practice. Certainly, if Mr. Cosgrove feels that her input, as I do, where are you, Dr. Donovan, okay, value her input in the hiring, the creation of such a policy, I don't think the involvement is as necessary considering all she has on her plate right now. So although I respect your motion and I respect the timeline, I'm a little uncomfortable with the direction that and the timeline involved, but we are certainly going to get one done very, very quickly. And at next month's meeting, when we have an update, I would certainly be prepared at that time to give a solid, and we can stick to March. You mentioned March. I think somebody in the audience mentioned March. We'll try to stick to that March, and I certainly, you hear me saying it now, but we can put it in place once we have more detail into what we feel needs to be done.
I'm going to.
But we do have a motion and a second on the floor.
You know what? I am going to withdraw that motion.
Okay, we have a motion to withdraw.
What I will do is I have a very good anti-nepotism that doesn't just touch the bases, it hits it out of the park. So if this board is really serious about doing that, then that is something we should vote on next meeting.
We're looking at the hiring policy. Any information in addition to the hiring policy that you wish to share with the board?
I will have that information.
More than happy. All right, we do have a withdrawal on a motion. Do we have a second? I guess we need a second on the withdrawal. All right, we have a second on the withdrawal. No, we don't. Okay, motion. Mr. Chandler, excuse me.
But the only thing is, the one thing I want to reinforce is that, you know, we continue here to talk about this thing. And we have one man running this district who's the superintendent of this district.
That is correct.
And this evening, all we did is talk about this stuff without listening to his recommendation.
That's correct.
He runs this district. He's the 10th member of this board. And until we start understanding that, we're not going to go anywhere. The kind of motion we should make is to cut the political bullshit and just do our jobs and let this man do his job. That's what we need to do.
That hiring policy was helping with
Stop.
All right, so we have a motion, we have a withdrawal motion. Mr. Gorzagowski, I please stick to that.
I'm gonna get through this. Come hello, high water. I'm gonna get through this. If it's the last thing I know, I'm gonna stand my ground. I won't let them keep me down. Even if you've got to carry me, oh